Eschatology, or the study of the end times, is a controversial topic among Christians. Not just controversial, denominations divide, pastors are kicked out of their churches, and the Twitter wars rage fiercely, all because of differing beliefs about how the end times are going to play out. And frankly, it's for good reason. What you believe about things to come plays a big part in how we live our Christian faith in the present. So we want to make sure that we have all of our theological ducks in a row when it comes to eschatology. So what are the major views about the end times that cause Christians to draw their lines in the sand? Well, it all starts with what you think of this thing called the Millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ that's talked about in Revelation 20. We've got to get this ironed out because Ezekiel 40 through 48 all take place during the Millennium, and that's what we're going to be studying here in 2025 on this podcast. So I want to talk about the four main views of the Millennium today, and where I come down on it, and how I'm going to be interpreting these last 9 chapters of Ezekiel, all of that today on the Cross References podcast. Welcome to the Book of Ezekiel, a cross-references Bible study, where we learn how every small piece of the Bible tells one big story, and how they all connect to the cross and Christ. My name is Luke Taylor, and I'm a millennial. Millennials are usually referred to as that generation that was born in the late 80s to the early 2000s, is a group of people who grew up during the transitional period from the rise of the internet, cell phones, social media, and the digital age. But there is actually another millennial generation coming, and this one's going to enter an even greater transitional period of the world, the 1,000-year kingdom of Jesus Christ. And don't worry, that generation is not going to be marked by man buns and a dedication to avocado toast. That generation will be marked by righteousness and a devotion to God. It will be a world unlike anything that has ever taken place in the past world history. And so today you're here for the first part of what I envision to be at least a 12-part series looking at the world of the millennial kingdom of Jesus Christ. There are chapters and there's psalms and there's prophecies scattered all throughout the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, that talk about this period of time. And yet most Christians don't know all that much about it. And so that's why I wanted to do this series for the study for myself, but then also why I wanted to share it here with you. And so most Christians know, most of what all Christians know about the millennium, it's there in Revelation chapter 20. There's really a whole lot more about the millennium throughout the Bible than just what's in Revelation 20, but Revelation 20 is what most Christians are familiar with. And since it's Revelation, many Christians kind of spiritualize the millennium away and treat it as something very symbolic. And so they don't place a whole lot of weight on the details of Revelation 20. Well, I want to explain today why I think that's a mistake. But to start off, let's just look at Revelation 20. Let's observe what it says. And I want you to notice how many times as we read these verses, how many times that you hear the phrase 1,000 years, okay? Before I go on, I also want to mention, if I sound a little different, I don't know if I sound different or not, but if I sound different today, for those of you listening on podcast, it's because I'm also putting this out as a live YouTube video, and this is a very new thing for me. I'm just figuring out how a lot of this works, and so I got some features here that I'm playing around with, but I hope to be able to put the verses up on the screen for you too. We have 10 verses to read today, so that's probably not going to happen this time. But I hope to get a little bit better at it. I got the theme song in this time. That was something I missed out on having last time. So we got the theme song in there. I want to try to get better and better at this as the weeks go forward. But I'm going to try to, on Sunday nights. You get it on Sunday night right now. And I'm going to try to put these YouTube lives and do them on Sunday nights so that the podcast is ready to come out as usual on Monday. And so I will try to do that for the YouTube viewers, those who like to follow me on YouTube. If you like to follow me on podcast, and here's a little graphic I put together. There you go. If you like to follow on podcast, you only hear the audio then, but that's what has basically been throughout the history of this show. So you can look it up right there. The name on podcasting is The Book of Ezekiel, a cross-references Bible study. There's kind of a whole story of why that name ended up being so long. But that is how you find it. Wherever you get your podcast, you can find The Book of Ezekiel, a cross-references Bible study. And I hope you'll be subscribed to that. And so anyway, like I said, I'm still kind of new at this live streaming thing. And in the weeks ahead, I hope to be able to put the verses up on screen for you too. If you want to read along with me, this is Revelation chapter 20, and I'm going to read the first 10 verses. It says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. And they march up over the broad plain of the earth and surround the camp of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, forever and ever." So I said a few moments ago, try to keep track of how many times you heard the phrase 1,000 years as we read those 10 verses about the millennium. 6 times in that passage, it used the phrase 1,000 years. Notice it didn't ever call it the millennium. That's what we call it. That's our theological term that we've slapped on it. Nothing wrong with that term. But the word millennium, it's a word that we use to describe it because a millennium means 1,000 years. The way that the Bible tells it to us is they just call it 1,000 years, 6 times, a 1,000 year period. And it's really weird that it happens 6 times because if you remember last week's episode, we were talking about just all the sevens throughout all the scripture. And I think Revelation probably has the highest concentration of sevens anywhere in the Bible. So many sevens in the book of Revelation. And yet it's just a little odd that the 1,000 years is mentioned 6 times because it does so much other stuff in sevens. If you've got an insight on that, please let me know. I'd love to hear if someone has an insight on that. And you can leave your insights if you leave a comment here on the chat thing, then that's a way that you can leave feedback as well. So happy to get those comments there on the chat, but I'll keep moving along for now. So what exactly is the millennial kingdom of Jesus all about in Revelation 20? Well, there's 4 major schools of thought when it comes to eschatology. As I said earlier, the line of division often starts with how they think about the millennium. The way that let me put up a graphic here. There we go. I spent like 5 minutes putting that together, so I want to make sure I don't forget it. The way you interpret Revelation 20 plays a huge role in how you read all of Revelation, as well as all of the prophetic or end times teachings in Scripture. And so the millennium is not something, it's not something we come to last when it comes to studying eschatology, even though it does come at the very end of the Bible. The millennium is actually the starting point for the study of eschatology, because what you do with the millennium, it affects what you do with basically everything else when it comes to Bible prophecy. And so I want to talk about 4 views today. I'm not going to attack or run. There's only one aspect I want to go after on one of them, but I'll explain why. I honestly, I don't have anything against Christians for whichever of the 4 views that they take of the millennium. I'm going to explain the view I want to take in this podcast and how I'm going to be looking at Revelation 20 and the last 9 chapters of Ezekiel, the way that I'm going to frame it. But I'll talk about that. I'll talk about why I picked the view that I do. But listen, this is one of those things. I got no hatred, got no anger, no malice toward anyone who takes a different view of it. So I'm not mad at anybody. There is one view I'll talk about later that I have some big issues with, but we'll get to that in a few. So the first one today is called preterism. And I think preterism is a really fascinating view. Preterists basically believe that the book of Revelation has already played out. That when John wrote it, John was basically writing history, not future prophecy. Now, if you're saying, wait a minute, how could they arrive at that conclusion? Like, why would they think that Jesus actually came back 2,000 years ago? Well, this is why I think preterism is really fascinating, because they find parallels for a whole lot of things in Revelation that happened in the first century of the church, especially when it comes to like the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD. When it comes to the Antichrist, they have found, they believe that he was Emperor Nero. So they're not waiting for a future Antichrist to come someday. They think he was already here, and it was the Emperor Nero. To their credit, they have pretty effectively tied him to the number 666. So they believe that the abomination of desolation that Jesus warned about, that it was the destruction of the temple. They believe the tribulations that are talked about during the book of Revelation, that these are things that, they didn't literally happen like worldwide earthquakes and asteroids striking the earth. And they didn't literally happen like that 2,000 years ago, but they believe those are symbolically referring to the tribulations that the early church went through, the persecutions that they went through, because the first century was a time of very intense persecution. So it's a very interesting idea. Like I said, I do disagree with it. Where this intersects with the millennium is that they believe that the millennium's already happened. There's full and partial preterists. So partial preterists think that perhaps we're in the millennium right now. Full preterists believe that the millennium happened right after the destruction of the temple, and that the millennium didn't last very long. That it was not a literal 1,000 years. It was probably not even 10 years. Okay, so my major disagreement with preterists when it comes to the book of Revelation, and especially the millennium here, Revelation was written in AD 90. So it was written by the Apostle John, and I think he's the last living apostle by this point. He's been exiled to the Isle of Patmos, and preterism alleges that everything that John was writing about at that point, that it was all historical, that it had all already happened, and that it was not something from the future. And when Jesus shows up in Revelation 1, he says John is supposed to write about metatauta, about things that shall come thereafter. And so to me, it's like if they've already happened, then how could they be thereafter? So I'm sure preterists have an answer for that. But to me, like, it just really takes the teeth out of Revelation if you say that it's all a retelling of past events. So anyway, in summary, preterism takes on the millennium. That's what I'm focused on here. They say that it is not a literal 1,000 years, that it was less than 1,000, and that it already happened. The second view I want to talk about is amillennial, or some say it amillennialism. And so amillennialism takes the 1,000 years also as symbolic. They say that the reign of Christ is going on right now, and that Jesus Christ is currently reigning in our hearts. And then they also treat the judgments of Revelation chapter 6 through 19 as something that did happen in history, but also as things that are going to happen repeatedly, kind of in cycles all throughout history. And so evil world leaders like the Antichrist, that they're going to come again and again and again, but that's just a part of living here in this fallen world. And that they believe that until the millennium ends, because they say that we're in the millennium right now, that's just the way things are going to play out here in the world until this current age of the millennium ends, and it will end by the second resurrection. So if you remember from our verses as we were reading about the millennium earlier in Revelation 20, verses 4 through 6, the amillennials believe that was just a spiritual resurrection. It's talking about how you receive new life whenever you get saved. But that is not talking about people who've already died coming back to life. They believe the second resurrection is the physical resurrection of the dead for judgment that's going to be talked about at the end of Revelation 20. So their idea of the millennium, that's what I want to focus on really here, is like, what do they think about the millennium? So like I said, they think it's going on right now, that we're currently in the millennium, and that it's not literally 1,000 years, because at this point, it's been 2,000 years and counting. And in fact, I recently was listening to an interview with Sam Storms, and he was being interviewed on the Charismatic Cheetah podcast. And both of those guys are pretty unique. So They're both charismatics, or they believe in the spiritual gifts. They're both Calvinists, and they're both amillennialists. And so I just remember this from the interview that something that he said in this interview. He said, all of the thousands in the Bible are non-literal. And I thought, really? So I looked up all the thousands in the Bible, and some of them are non-literal, but I don't take them all as non-literal. For example, Samson killing 1,000 Philistines in the book of Judges, I just kind of always took that literally. Like, I don't know how most Christians take it. Maybe that's too far-fetched for them. To me, I'm just like, okay, Samson was a tough dude. If he killed 1,000 of them, and I don't quibble. It maybe is 999. Maybe it was 1,010. Maybe it was just rounding. But I figure it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000. I took that pretty much literally. And then there's other passages, Numbers 31. There you go. The tribes of Israel are getting ready for a battle against Midian. And it said that 1,000 men were contributed from each one of the tribes for this battle, leading to a fighting force of 12,000 men. And so again, I just take that as literal. Genesis 12:16, Abimelech gives Abraham 1,000 pieces of silver. Now, there's other 1,000s that you can look at in Scripture, and they're obviously not literal. Like when it says that God has the cattle on 1,000 hills. When God says he'll show love to 1,000 generations. With the Lord, 1,000 years are as a day. So yeah, there's clearly figures of speech, poetic language, stuff like that goes on in the Bible. But I would disagree that every 1,000 in the Bible is symbolic. Like, I see no reason to think that Abimelech's offering to Abraham that was not literally 1,000 pieces of silver. So that's why this goes back to Sam Storm said, well, all the thousands in the Bible are symbolic. Well, I don't think I would go that far. I don't think you can go that far. If people think that all the thousands in the Bible are symbolic, that was very much news to me. So we've looked at two views today on the millennium. Preterism, it says that it was not 1,000 years, it was less than 1,000, and that the millennium's already happened. And amillennialism says that it's also not 1,000 years, it's more than 1,000, and that we're in it right now. The third view that I want to talk about today is called postmillennialism. The postmillennialists, I think they also would say that they believe we're in the millennium right now, and they think that we're kind of working on the millennium. They have a very optimistic view about the millennium, probably the most optimistic end times view I've ever heard. They say that the millennium is going to begin whenever we get everybody saved. And when I say everybody, I mean like everybody in the world. Or some will say whenever we make every nation in the world a Christian nation, that's basically when the millennium has been fulfilled, and then Jesus can come back literally. So that's probably the strangest aspect of how they view the millennium. They say that after we have the 1,000-year reign of Christ, then Jesus comes back, that he comes back at the end of it, that he doesn't come back until after the millennium is already over. That's why it's called post-millennialism, because post means after. So they think Jesus is coming back after the millennium wraps up, and they don't believe that the 1,000-year reign of Christ includes Christ being physically on this earth during that time. And similar to preterists, they think that the tribulation period was back in the first century, that after the temple was destroyed, that was whenever we entered the period of the millennium, which again, it's not a literal 1,000 years. And so they say that we're currently living in this millennial period in which we're supposed to basically conquer the world for Jesus so that he can finally come back. Now, that's their view. Hey, if they want to hold to that, I mean, more power to them. I respect their positivity about where things are heading in the world, where things are heading in society. I'm getting a notification right here. I'm going to check something. Okay, it says I'm still live. Can you all see me right now? It's telling me YouTube's not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming. So if you can all put in the chat or something like that, if you're not seeing me, let me know, and then I'll know I'm not just talking to the air. But it says my connection is poor. Okay, I'm going to take it that my connection is still there. So let me check it here. Okay, I want to keep pushing ahead. and assume that you all are seeing me. Hope you can see me. But anyway, I want to keep going here. So, it says chat disconnected. Like I said, smoothing out a lot of the kinks here, getting started on this. Okay, well, I'll keep pushing forward, and I'm just going to assume it's all working. If not, I got the recording here on my computer. I can upload it whenever I'm done. So anyway, listen, if some Christians go with that view, again, more power to them. Respect the positivity there. There's one group of postmillennialists that that are getting a little bit under my skin lately, and it's what you might call the Christian nationalist bros. Okay, and again, I'm not even going to say this is all postmillennialists, not at all. Okay, but there is a group, and they've kind of grown in more popularity or notoriety, you might say, in the news a lot the past few years, is the Christian nationalist bros, who basically believe that the way that we're going to conquer the world for Jesus is that we're all just going to band together, and we're going to start by making kind of a Christian subculture with our own schools, our own towns, our own local governance, and by Christians. And so we only want to be ruled by Christians, and then we're going to use that to just keep growing and growing until we dominate our counties, and then dominate our states, and eventually dominate our country, and eventually dominate the world. And so I don't have so much a problem with Christians banding together and doing some of that stuff, like creating their own local communities. I could see a lot of benefits to that. I could also see some downsides to it, but I'm not going to deny that there's some benefits that could be there to that. So if that's what some Christians want to do, I'd say they are welcome to go for it. What I get concerned about is kind of the militant attitude that some of these online people take toward their faith. Like that if we can culturally dominate America and make it a Christian nation again, wonderful, that's great. But some nations are not going to accept that in their country. They're not going to put up with that without a fight. And so, and I'd say this too. Some of these Christian nationalist bros online, again, not all of them, not all postmillennialists, but there's a vocal minority of them who are just straight up racist. Okay? Again, not claiming all post-millennials are racist or anything like that. If I meet a post-millennialist, I don't make any judgments. I don't make assumptions about them. They're a fellow Christian. Love them. But there's some of these Christian nationalist groups that the ones who want to be separate from society and make their own little Christian communities, and they'll be pretty open about the fact they want it to be a white Christian community. And so they don't really make any bones about it. They don't hide the fact. They're pretty open about that. So just kind of a sick thing that I'm seeing sometimes here online that is just a big turnoff. And you're mainly seeing it though from this post-millennialist mindset of, it comes with this idea of we need to take the world over for Christ. And so that's why I'm bringing it all up here. This Christian nationalist movement, and not everything about it is bad, but it comes out of post-millennialism. That if you start with the idea that we got to get the world saved, if we're ever going to enter this golden age of the millennial kingdom, then, you know, if that's the idea you're starting out with, you got to have some kind of strategy to get there. And so that's where this comes from. Most of the people in the Christian nationalist movement are post-millennial, okay? And probably not even all of them, but that's mainly where this comes from. And one more thing on the Christian nationalism front, and I'm not honestly concerned about that crowd. Like, they're a pretty fringe group to me, okay? I think they're pretty harmless because I don't take the same view of where things are going in society that they do. I don't think we're creating a Christian world. I don't think that's where things are heading societally or globally or anything like that. So I'm not concerned about them. But one thing that's pretty clear to me is if they did actually get into power, some of them would be persecuting Christians for having different theology on things like spiritual gifts and the rapture. They'd be coming after Christians like me. Many post-millennials come from more of a reform background. Some of them think that if you don't accept Calvinism, that you're basically a heretic and basically an enemy of the gospel. And some of them will say they think the biggest hindrances to Christianity's growth in the world, they'll blame things like the Pentecostal movement, or they'll blame people who believe in a pre-trib rapture for the ills of society. You know, it's amazing some of the things we get blamed for. And I think some of those Christians would would literally burn me at the stake if they got control of the government. I think they would probably crack down on stuff like that. Again, I'm not worried about that happening because I just don't foresee them getting that kind of control. But if someone's a post-millennial believer, I don't have any qualms with them. I disagree with their eschatology, but I accept them as fellow Christians. And I would say this too, to many people in society, I would be considered a Christian nationalist because I think things like abortion are wrong. I think gay marriage is wrong, and I think they should be outlawed. So there's many people in society who would say, well, you're trying to impose your Christian views on us legally, so that makes you a Christian nationalist. And so someone slapped that label on me. Frankly, I don't care. You know, it's just name calling. People will try to shut you up by identifying you with some fringe group. And when people want to slap labels on me, I'm like, I'm not going to waste my day arguing about the label. It's really one of those phrases. It can mean different things depending on the person who is saying it. Okay, so there's probably things I've said today that Christian nationalists believe that they might say, well, I don't believe that. You know, it's just one of those terms that's open to interpretation. I'm not going to sit here and argue about who has the right interpretation. So, you know, call me one if you want to. I say worse things about myself in the worship songs on Sunday mornings at church. So, you know, my biggest issue I'd say this about post-millennialism and all-millennial, these words are too many syllables for this late at night. All-millennialism, even preterism. But some of my biggest issues here is actually what it does with Satan. Because if you believe that we're in the millennium right now, here's what Revelation chapter 20 said about the millennium. It said in the first few verses, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. So if we're in the millennium right now, then that would mean that Satan should be bound right now. But to me, that's just like, that's a little hard to believe if I look out my window. And I've had lots of conversations online with people who take this view, and I'm like, how could you say the devil's not active in the world today? You know, even with all these warnings about him that are throughout the New Testament. And their answer to me has been that this is symbolic language here in Revelation 20. And what it's really saying is that Satan can't deceive the nations, but that he can still deceive people. And to me, I don't buy that. You know, because last I checked, nations are made up of people. So to say that Satan can deceive people, but that he can't deceive nations, to me, that's like a distinction without a difference. Like I've asked them before, what's different if Satan can deceive the nations versus if he can't deceive the nations? What would be different about the world? And they don't have any answers for me on that. So they can't explain what the functional difference would be when Satan is bound versus when he's not bound. And like, it doesn't seem to make a big difference to them one way or the other. So when I look out the window, it looks like the nations are pretty deceived out there. And if Satan were bound, it's like, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all these warnings. You know, the New Testament talks about Satan going about as a roaring lion, how the Antichrist is said to work signs by the power of Satan, how James says we need to resist the devil. So I can't square all that with the idea that Satan is currently bound. To me, Jesus ruling the world means Jesus ruling the world, not Jesus ruling the hearts of Christians around the world. And to me, Satan being bound means Satan is bound, not that he's just symbolically bound. So that brings me to what I believe about the future is premillennialism. That's the more literal interpretation of the Bible. And I tend to interpret the Bible more literally than most Christians. That's why I'd be identified as a premillennialist. And so that's the last view I want to talk about today. You could even break this view and some of these other views. You could break them up further. We could talk about dispensational premillennialism and all that stuff, but I'm not even talking about dispensations or the rapture really today. I'm just focusing on how Christians interpret this 1,000-year period called the reign of Christ. So this is the most literal of the four views, because it takes the 1,000 year reign of Christ as literally 1,000 years, a literal millennium. That's what millennium means. And so what I believe is that, I'm not trying to get into the rapture stuff. I think the rapture happens, then the tribulation happens, then Jesus returns, then the millennium begins. And so that's why I'm called premillennial, because I believe Jesus comes back before the millennium. And by the way, that's the order that things play out in the book of Revelation. The tribulation starts in chapter 6. It goes all the way to chapter 19. And then Revelation 19:11 says these words. Then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True. And in righteousness he judges and makes war. So, spoiler alert, that is Jesus right there. That right there is the second coming of Christ. And notice the first word of Revelation 19:11, it starts with then. Okay? The word then means after the thing that just happened before. All right? If I was telling you a story and I said, I flew to Japan and then I got thrown in prison and then I got out and I went to ninja school and then I came back to America and I used my ninja skills to become a superhero, well, you would understand that story as having had all those things happen in sequential order, one right after another. It wouldn't make sense if I told you that story and I actually meant that I became a superhero before I went to Japan and went to ninja school. I was using the word then to denote the sequential order of events of how I did all those things. All right. And for those of you who might not know, that's the plot of the first hour of Batman Begins. So Christopher Nolan, he might not know how to tell a story in sequential order, but the Bible does. And the Bible is not trying to trick us as we look at the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is putting everything together for us. All right. It's all the Old Testament prophets, they were giving us pieces. Revelation puts all those pieces together and they put it all into one story. And so that's why I give Revelation, I give it priority whenever I'm trying to understand the order of events in the end times. So Revelation 19:11, after like 13 chapters of carnage and destruction on the earth and all this stuff we call the tribulation, then it says, then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. And so from that point on, Jesus annihilates his enemies. He annihilates the armies of the Antichrist. And then Revelation 20 begins, and it says, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. Okay, notice the word then once again. Jesus comes back, then Satan is bound. Verse 4, then I saw the thrones. Verse 7, and when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison. Verse 11, then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. So Revelation 20 verse 11, that's when postmillennialists will say that Jesus returned. But Revelation 20 didn't say that's when Jesus returned. Revelation 19 said Jesus returned. And then this happened, and then that happened, and so on and so forth, sequentially and in order. And so as a premillennialist, I believe that the events of the book of Revelation are going to happen sequentially, just as they are laid out in the order of that book. The only exception would be chapters 12 through 14. And chapters 12 through 14 is just a little bit unique in Revelation. It's kind of a step back and kind of a comprehensive view of like salvation history, all of church history, basically. But if you notice, chapter 12 doesn't start with the word then. Chapter 12 starts with, and a great sign appeared in heaven. So I think Revelation's trying to be clear about when something happens in sequence and when it doesn't. And I think the word then is in there for a reason, and that it means exactly what it means in every other book that you read. And so that's simple to me. It's clear and easy to understand. That's why I like to take the Bible literally. And so there's my views of, or there's an explanation, I guess, of what the 4 different mainline views of how we think about this thing called the millennium, how that all plays out. And that's kind of why I take the tack that I do on it. There's going to be strengths with every view. There's going to be weaknesses with every view. I mean, yeah, Christ does reign in our hearts. I mean, I'll agree with that. But I just think there's more to it than that whenever we talk about the millennium. There's strengths and weaknesses to all the views. But going forward, I'm going to be taking the premillennial view as we look at these last 9 chapters of Ezekiel. So I'm not done talking about premillennialism yet. next time on this podcast, I want to give you an overview of what the millennium is like according to the premillennial framework. All right, so next week is going to be kind of the broad overview of the millennium. And then for the next 10 weeks after that, we're going to be focusing and honing in on individual elements of the millennium that happen within that story. So again, make sure you're subscribed so you can get it. And I just had one mailbag comment this week I wanted to share. There was a listener who reached out named Amanda, and she says, thank you for sticking to your guns and speaking truth. And so thank you to Amanda for your comment there. And if you got a comment, if you want to send an email, crossreferencespodcast@gmail.com. And appreciate any feedback you guys always want to leave. Let's see. We had Layman Seminary says, hi, I'm pre-mill. I'm debating an A-mill this month. So, hey, best wishes to you. Good luck with it. And, I hope the attitude I've given in this episode today is even when have disagreements with other Christians, I don't hate them. I hope, when I debate them or if I have disagreement with them, that I can always do it in a charitable way, believing the best about each other, not getting hateful and angry about it. I get a lot of anger and flack thrown at me on Twitter. And so I know how it feels. I don't want to make other people feel that way. So I try to be a little bit gentle and Christian about it, I guess is the way to say it. So, the only thing I really kind of went after today is just where the Christian nationalist bros will get a bit on the racist side. I'm not crazy about that. I think there's some Christian nationalists who I probably have no problems with. Most post-mills I have no problems with, but the racism thing that's been kind of blooming in society lately, that's a step backwards for us, and we need to do better than that, especially in the church. So one more note today on taking things literally. I still acknowledge that there's symbolism in the Bible, okay? I just spoke on this a lot when I was going through Ezekiel 38 and 39 just a couple months ago here on the podcast. There is so much in those chapters where it's debated on what do we take historically, what do we take literally, and what do we take symbolically? And maybe I could explain it like this. When I say something is symbolic, I'm saying it means something else, but it's still meaning a physical thing. It's still meaning a real thing, okay? Revelation 6, it says, I looked and behold a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer, okay? I believe that's talking about the Antichrist right there. I don't think he's literally going to come out with a bow, probably not literally a crown, but I think the crown is symbolic, but it means that he's going to be given control. It means he's going to, or you might even say kingship. I think the bow is referring to a covenant that he's going to make whenever he comes on the scene. So I know that those are symbols and I can take them symbolically, but I think that they mean literal things. And most other views of Revelation, they'll say, oh, it's symbolic, but what they do is they kind of spiritualize it away so that it doesn't mean anything anymore in the physical realm. Some would read about the Antichrist there in Revelation 6. They'd say, oh, well, it's a spiritual bow. It's a spiritual crown. And I'm like, okay, well, what does that even mean then? When we just say it's a spiritual this or that, what meaning does that apply to our lives anymore? When you say Satan is bound, but he's only spiritually bound. Okay, well, what does that mean? What would be different if he weren't bound? So I have a problem with just kind of spiritualizing things away, because then they don't mean anything anymore. If you say Satan is bound, he can deceive people, he just can't deceive the nations. I need you to be able to explain what that means. I have a book, I pulled it off. It's usually right back here on the colorful shelf there behind me, but a book by Tim Chester. Hey, I've talked to Tim Chester before. I love Tim Chester. He wrote this simple commentary. I say simple because it's only a couple hundred pages, but he wrote this commentary on Revelation, and he makes some comments in here that I don't know exactly if he's amill or post-mill or what. He says, this is how we should approach the book of Revelation. Lean in too close, look only at the detail, it's all a bit perplexing. But step back, look at the big picture, and Revelation not only becomes clearer, but grabs our imaginations. And I'm like, when I read the Bible, I'm trying to figure out these details. I'm not trying to let my imagination run away with me. I'm not just trying to get the vibe. Like, I want to know, why does it say, why is it 144,000? Why is it not 145,000? Why is it not 10,000? Like, I think the numbers mean something. I mean, I'd say it means there's literally going to be 144,000 servants. That's a whole subject for another time. Another comment here in his book, he says, John layers one image on another. We're not meant to piece these images together like a jigsaw puzzle to construct a single whole. We get one image and then that's replaced by a new image. Don't be freaked out by this. And then on it goes. And I'm like, I think you can take all the pieces and put it together into a whole. Like when I read Revelation, I put it all together and I see the whole story coming together there. And it's seeing threads from all of the Bible, all of Scripture that are all getting tied in together here in the book of Revelation. So to me, like, I think it all makes sense when you put it all together. I'm not saying I understand every verse of Revelation, but in general, I don't have much issue piecing things together. I think that's what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to approach the Bible. I think the details matter. You know, when it says 3.5 years, I take that as 3 years and 6 months, 1,260 days. And when it says again and again in chapter 20, 1,000 years, I take that as 1,000 years. And so one more distinction that premillennialists like me or literalists, one distinction that we take from other views is that we believe that the church is the church and that Israel is Israel, that God has a plan for the church and that plan ends with the rapture. And God has a plan for Israel. And that plan is detailed in the book of Revelation also. And it's detailed in the Old Testament prophets. It's detailed in Ezekiel, which we're going to be reading and studying very closely in the weeks ahead. God has a plan for Israel. The church has not replaced Israel in God's plan, but God still has plans for Israel in the future. And God doesn't just have a plan for Israel's future. God has a plan for your future. And so make sure that you understand God's plan for the future so that you can figure out how you fit into it. Because what you believe about things to come plays a big part in how we live our Christian faith in the present. Thanks for listening to this Cross References Bible study on the book of Ezekiel. This has been Luke Taylor, and I hope the Bible makes more sense to you after this episode.